Let's say you're designing a board game for kids that's meant to teach some kind of lesson, like about the value of teamwork. Since you're a very smart game designer, you know that you need to come up with game mechanics that align with this theme. Maybe you make it a cooperative game where players have to share resources and work together against some kind of environmental threat. You build the game to incentivize the sorts of behaviors that you want players to learn, connecting the game's goal, teaching teamwork, to the game's mechanics, working as a team. But what if you were trying to make a game about something a little more nuanced and a little less broad than teamwork? What if you were trying to make a game for kids that taught them the value of, say, patriotism? What would that even look like? What kinds of mechanics would align with that? Would it be competitive or cooperative? And what actions and incentives would nudge players toward patriotism? Those are tricky questions, and the answers change depending on how you, the designer, define patriotism. Different kinds of patriotism require different kinds of mechanics. When we play a board game, we do so using rules, mechanics, and themes that have been chosen by the game's designers for reasons. And those reasons are communicated to us through the game's mechanics. The scoring system tells you whether you need to collaborate or compete with the other players. The goals, combined with the game's mechanics, tell us whether we are to manipulate our opponents or bargain with them, whether we are to cleverly profit off their actions or simply attack them. A game's goals tell us what to care about during the game. Sometimes these kinds of mechanical choices are explicit rhetorical moves, where the designers are actively trying to nudge players towards a certain goal, like teamwork or patriotism. But mechanical choices can also just be a reflection of the culture or historical moment that a designer is working from. The authors of the game design textbook Rules of Play illustrate this with the example of chaturanga, which is the precursor to chess that came from ancient India. The rules governing movement and interaction reflect the values and social hierarchies of the Indian military of the 5th century. Over time, as the game spread from country to country, modifications were made to the design of the game pieces to reflect the particular strengths of national armies. The introduction of these new pieces, such as the queen and the bishop, were not merely superficial changes, but impacted the formal structure of the game. In this way, games carry cultural baggage, so their mechanics can tell you a lot about the societies in which they were made, what they value, how they solve problems, how they define success. But games aren't just reflections of what a society values. They are also teaching tools that help instill those values in players, preserving those values across generations. In other words, games are social contexts for cultural learning, where the values of a society are embodied and passed on. Games instill or fortify a culture's value system and replicate, reproduce, and sometimes transform cultural beliefs and principles. Games hold a lot of meaning, and that meaning gets expressed to players through mechanics, the moment-by-moment gameplay tools at our disposal, the rules that constrain our use of those tools, and the goals that we're trying to reach with those tools. And the lessons embedded within those mechanics reflect not just what a society itself is like, but also what that society wants for itself, the values that it wants to pass on to its children. Games are mirrors of the present, reflections of the designers and the cultures they live in. But they are also arguments for what the future should be. In late 2025, PragerU published Celebrate America, Race to the White House, released in preparation for the United States semi-quincentennial, our 250th birthday. Celebrate America is marketed as a trivia game, but really, it's just Chutes and Ladders. There is trivia involved, but at its core, it's Chutes and Ladders. You answer trivia questions to move along the board, trying to land on rockets that send you up, and avoid trains that slide you back down. The issue is that you only move when you answer a question correctly, but because of the trains, you could get the answer right and still end up further behind than you started. 50 years ago, Spirit of America, the Bicentennial game, was released in preparation for the country's 200th birthday. It's a basic roll and move game where you begin by reading a history monologue from the game book, then take turns rolling dice and moving along the board, periodically landing on squares that prompt you to answer trivia, about that history story from the beginning. The issue is that anytime you land on a blue square, you have to draw a card from the blue deck. And those cards either end your turn or send you forward or back some amount of squares. So what ends up happening is that you roll the dice, land on a blue square, draw a card that then sends you back 2 squares, landing you on another blue square where you have to draw another blue card, and you end up getting caught in this never-ending loop of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. In other words, you can do everything right and still end up further behind than you started. In 50 years of patriotic board game design, nothing has changed. We are still caught in the same loop of trivia and games of chance. But what do these mechanics mean? When I found out that PragerU was releasing a patriotic board game, I knew that I needed to play it, as both an expert in tearing down PragerU's poor pedagogical offerings and something of a board game connoisseur myself. But it also piqued my interest in a larger question about patriotic board games. Namely, what are they? Why do they exist? And what do they say about patriotism? Over the past few months, I have been trying to answer these questions, and one of the first things that I learned is that patriotic board games are actually pretty rare. When you search patriotic board games, you mostly just get America-themed versions of other games. USA Trivial Pursuit, America-opoly, decks of cards with stars and stripes on the back, that kind of thing. And when you do find original games labeled as patriotic, the results are not exactly the most compelling games I've ever come across. I've already talked about how PragerU's game is just Chutes and Ladders with trivia tacked on, and Spirit of America's core gameplay is just reading history monologues and answering questions about them. But of the 7 patriotic games I was able to get my hands on, 6 of them were trivia games. And the only one that wasn't a trivia game was just a clone of Careers, a classic board game from the 50s. And yet, I still played them. Over the course of 5 days, while my family was trapped at my house for the holidays, we played all 7 of these games. And I've done my best to try to suss out what patriotism means to them, what patriotic board games even is as a genre, but that's easier for some than others. For instance, USA Trivia and Patriot Challenge, 2 of the more straightforward and simple trivia games, both come right out and tell us what they're doing and why. USA Trivia, published in 1985, opens its rules with the line, "Patriotic Americans always want to know more about the United States." And then they go on to explain that the game is meant to help players learn American history, government, and geography, as well as our great national parks, historical sites, and tourist attractions. Because, in their words, the more that players of USA Trivia know about the United States, the better citizens they become. Patriot Challenge, published in 2003, puts a definition of the word patriot on the back of their rulebook, defining it as a fellow countryman, one who loves and loyally or zealously supports one's own country. Then, on the back of the box, they tell players the game's goal is to promote teamwork, freedom of expression, tolerance, and responsible citizenship. For some of the games, I was able to scrape their websites and press releases for information about their goals, like 2012's We the People calling itself a laugh-out-loud crash course about the effects of big government policies on American life, or 2013's Modern Revolution openly admitting that the creator was inspired to make the game because his favorite right-wing talk show hosts said the Constitution was under attack, and the only way to protect it is with board games, I guess. But the rest of the games were relatively opaque about their definitions of patriotism and their rhetorical aims. It's hard to tell whether this opacity is the fault of the game designers, whether they even know what their game's ultimate goal is, whether they know how they're defining patriotism, or whether it's some feature of patriotism itself. Patriotism is famously challenging to define. At its most basic, it's love of one's country, but love is kind of broad, right? What kind of love makes someone a patriot, and how deeply do they have to feel it? And how is it different from something like pride? And if we're defining vague words, what does country even mean here? Is a country its government? Its people? Its land? Is it a set of cultural practices? Where is the line between patriotism and nationalism? Writers and philosophers have been debating these questions for ages, and I know that they're not going to be answered by a handful of board games. My point is that patriotism is a squishy topic, and everyone comes to it with their own preconceptions. When I was playing these games with my family, the first thing I did was ask everyone how they defined patriotism, and everyone's answers were different. For one of my siblings, it was about believing in American exceptionalism and an implicit support for the government's actions. For my partner, it was about supporting the country as it is, judging it for what it does for its people in real, tangible ways, regardless of any of its lofty ideals. For my mom, it was about valuing the things that made our country unique, especially the natural beauty and incredible landscapes we have. But I'm sure you define it differently. I know I do. So please share in the comments, because I find it fascinating just how differently we all define this nebulous relationship to our country. And I'm especially interested in how people outside the US think about patriotism, because our brand of patriotism seems particularly particular. All of this is to say that I'm not blaming these games for being a little opaque about their terms. Patriotism is an inherently opaque topic. It just means that to understand what they're saying about patriotism, we're going to have to look a little deeper. We're going to have to look at their mechanics. Modern Revolution was published in 2013 and is purportedly a strategy game where you simulate ideological shift and democratic processes. To start the game, players take it in turns to put a single pawn in a single state until all states have pawns on them. These pawns represent the political views of the population of each state. Then the gameplay starts, and on a player's turn, they first draw a card from the Modern Revolution deck, which will apply either a small positive or negative modifier to their upcoming die rolls. There's also a small chance that the card contains a trivia question, which also gives a buff to the roll if answered correctly. Then the player challenges an opponent's state that borders one of theirs, and they and the other player do competing d20 rolls, with the active player adding the modifier that they got from their card earlier in their turn. This represents a debate, and whoever wins the contested roll now controls both states, representing the new political views of the people there. The active player does this 3 times per turn, and if they won 2 out of those 3 challenges, they get to draw a Constitution card, which each represent one of the amendments or articles of the Constitution, and is worth some amount of points. Then their turn is over. So what are these mechanics saying? In this game, you are supposed to be playing out democracy, showing how electoral politics functions, using pawns and dice rolls to simulate ideological shifts. So if we take the game at its word that it is trying to be a patriotic representation of political processes, then how are those things actually represented by the mechanics? Well, the ideologies of people in each state are represented by a single pawn, implying that they're uniform, and they can change based on debate. But those debates are represented by chance in the form of rolling dice. There's no relationship between ideology and the state's population, no sense of which ideology is which, no sense of which one would be better or worse for the people of the state, and, like with how ideological debate comes down to chance, the people of the state are similarly passive. Change happens to them almost arbitrarily. Remember, pawns represent ideology, not people. Players are competing to have their ideology beat other ideologies. People have nothing to do with it. But it's not like the game is ideologically neutral either. The cards that you draw to affect your die roll can be either positive or negative, and politically speaking, the positive ones are all nominally conservative, and the negative ones are all nominally liberal. Gun control legislation getting blocked gives you +3 per roll, but the Affordable Care Act getting passed is -2. What a game rewards and what it punishes tells us what the game values and what it's trying to incentivize its players to value. So with these mechanics, players are being primed to see conservative politics as positive and liberal ones as harmful. There's also an overwhelming cynicism to the whole thing. Embedded in these mechanics is the implication that political processes are all arbitrary and up to chance, that people's views are basically interchangeable and meaningless, and that what matters most is beating your opponents. This game is making an argument, whether or not it's the argument that its designers intended to make. While playing these 7 games, it was often hard to tell which of their mechanics were intended as overt rhetorical moves and which were implicit, invisible ideologies seeping in unintentionally. Sometimes the answer is obvious, like in We the People. The game starts with randomly selecting a game czar who gets to make several important choices throughout the game, including selecting each player's identities and starting resources. Once players have their identities, gameplay starts, with players rolling dice, answering trivia questions to collect stars, and periodically drawing cards from the Social Justice and Disappoint Big Brother decks while they move around Semi-Capitalist Street and the Path of Social Justice. The social justice cards are all caricatures of liberal policies that make you lose money or stars, which are then sent to the Porculus barrel, a stand-in for taxes which can get occasionally redistributed by the game czar. The Disappoint Big Brother cards are all virtue-signaling checkpoints that reward you with stars if you have, in real life, engaged in certain conservative behaviors, like praying for the president, watching It's a Wonderful Life, or living by the tenets of Glenn Beck's 9/12 Project. These are clear rhetorical choices by the designers. They are using these mechanics and the partisan theming to argue that patriotism is about not just supporting the country in a vacuum, but supporting the correct ideology. The game's mechanics make objective the author's position. Conservative ideology is positive, and social justice ideology is negative. The mechanics also tell players that ideology isn't just about beliefs, but about actions. You are a conservative and therefore a patriot, not by what you believe, but by what religious practices you perform, what movies you watch, which conservative talk radio hosts you support. Even the game czar is a transparent rhetorical choice. The game czar is a randomly selected player who gets to pick each player's starting resources, gets final say on rule arbitration, and periodically gets to decide who should get rewards or punishments based on nothing but their own opinion. With this mechanic, We the People has set up this fat cat who pits players against each other as the final arbiter of rules and whose main job is the unfair redistribution of your wealth. A perfect caricature of the Obama-era conservatives' view of big government. But overt rhetorical moves aren't always quite so obvious. For instance, several games include commentary with their trivia answers, attempting to nudge players towards the correct ideological perspective. We the People's trivia cards all include an entire paragraph of commentary with each answer, which is given a veneer of trustworthiness by the inclusion of sources for their claims. However, those sources are often sketchy websites, or books with titles like Arguing with Idiots and The Official Handbook of the Vast Right-Wing Conspiracy, so the ideological skew is embarrassingly apparent. USA Trivia also includes commentary with some of their answers, like when they had some snide remarks about Vietnam or Jimmy Carter or bringing back the death penalty, but they at least actually label their editorializing. Usually. There were also several instances where their answers included unlabeled ideological commentary, like another one complaining about Jimmy Carter, and one answer that seemed to claim that the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art was objectively the ugliest building on the National Mall. But it's never indicated to the player that these were editorialized. So in both of these games, there is a clear attempt to turn subjective perspectives into objective right or wrong answers by obscuring what's editorialized and what isn't. See, the problem is that I'm recovering from a cold, and so my voice is kind of struggling a little bit, but you know, the things I do for you, I do it for you. I do it for you. USA Trivia actually also had a mechanic similar to how We the People rewarded players for their real-life behaviors, like with one card that let players move ahead if they had read any Ayn Rand books. But what's more notable is how it did the opposite. USA Trivia would actually punish players for certain behaviors. A question about Horace Mann said, if player is a teacher, professor, or school administrator and missed this answer, roll the die and move pawn backwards. And there was a similar pop culture question that punished a player if they watched soap operas and missed the answer. These wouldn't be quite so rhetorically obvious, except for the fact that there weren't any similar instances for other kinds of jobs or hobbies. No questions about military history that said, if player is a veteran and missed this answer, send them back 3 states. To this game's designers, patriotism isn't just about knowing history facts, but also about having the right opinions and the right hobbies in the right ways. And there seems to be more intense scrutiny if those hobbies are feminine coded, which is a whole other can of worms. The most egregious arguments being made by these games, though, are the ones that I don't think the authors even really intended to make. They just slipped into the mechanics either via ideological bleed through or sheer incompetence. The former category is for things like the pedagogical assumptions that the authors probably never really stopped to interrogate before building their games around them. Spirit of America, for instance, says it wants to teach us about history, but it does so by making us sit through a 10-minute monologue and then holding us hostage with its hostile looping game mechanics, simply because it couldn't conceive of a different way to teach history. And the educational value of trivia aside, the questions in PragerU's Celebrate America are arguably pointless because they are incredibly easy, with questions like who signs a bill into law and which president issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Both of those are the adult versions of the questions, and one of them is worth 1 point, and the other is worth 6 points, and I guarantee you would never be able to guess which one is which, but feel free to leave your answers in the comments. Of all these games, though, my favorite mechanics are the ones that, if you think about them for more than 5 seconds, you realize that they're actually antithetical to the game itself. One example of this is in USA Trivia, where you move from one end of the board to another while answering trivia, but the states have no meaning. They have nothing to do with the questions you're asked, except for the arbitrarily chosen colors that determine which question you read from the card. And on top of that, USA Trivia's game map is fundamentally contradictory to the game's stated goals. I don't know if you noticed, but the highway that you traverse along completely ignores most of New England. How can a game be patriotic while overlooking 6 states, over 10% of the country? This game says that it wants you to care about the country, that it wants you to travel to see all the amazing things the US has to offer, but the designers couldn't even let you visit every state on a map they designed. PragerU's Celebrate America also has a state issue. There is an entire trivia category dedicated to states, but they don't actually ask about every single state, even though there are more than enough cards to do so. There were no questions about North Dakota, West Virginia, South Carolina, and somehow Pennsylvania. You know, the state where the First Continental Congress met, where the Declaration of Independence was signed, where the Constitution was written. I don't understand how a game about history could ignore Pennsylvania. And I am personally upset about them ignoring my home state of West Virginia, but Pennsylvania? Really? This game is also just slop. The art on the cards is clearly AI, and the questions themselves aren't just easy, but boring. It is all the most basic stuff, the most surface level trivia, and none of it feels connected to anything. I don't know how else to describe the vapidness of the questions other than floaty. The questions and their answers are just floating in the void, disconnected from any larger historical context. It's all so bland and flat that it passes into your brain and immediately turns to jello. So these games are trying to do something. Their designers are making arguments, but the results are just not good. These games were not fun to play, and even worse, they didn't feel patriotic. Sure, they include American flags and bald eagles and founding fathers, at least when they weren't being actively hostile to anyone who disagreed with them ideologically, but is that what patriotism is? Is patriotism just about knowing where George Washington was born, or what year the Louisiana Purchase was made, or which presidents are on Mount Rushmore? Is that all patriotism is? To many of these games, patriotism has to do with land, loving and protecting the land within your country's borders. But borders are just lines on a map. The land doesn't know where the US stops and Canada starts. Rivers cross borders, forests cross them, animals cross them. So, if the natural places that we love aren't limited by borders, then maybe our responsibility to protect them shouldn't be either. That feeling is a big part of why I joined Planet Wild, who helped to make this video possible. Planet Wild is a community-based conservation organization. It's basically like crowdfunding for nature. Every month, we as a community fund a mission to save forests and protect our oceans and bring back endangered species. And Planet Wild documents all of these missions in videos here on YouTube, so we can actually see what our contributions helped to achieve. One of my favorite things about Planet Wild is that they work directly with local organizations, so you know that your support is going to people who actually know what they're doing and who are uniquely invested in these projects. They find the people who know the land, who live there and who have their own methods, and fund them directly. Like one of their recent missions backed farmers in Tanzania who are reviving traditional farming techniques that were almost wiped out by colonialism to help regrow forests from these dormant underground root systems. It is actually really cool. But the point is that Planet Wild didn't just come in and tell locals what to do. They just helped to make sure that the local farmers had enough money and structural support to be able to continue practicing and training others in these techniques. And like I mentioned, they document everything. Every single mission gets a video and a full budget breakdown, and when you join, you get monthly video and text reports that show the community's impact. And part of what I love most about this is that it makes solutions feel real and tangible. Like I can literally see where my money is going. It is amazing. So if you want to be a part of a community that actually makes a difference, not just knowing facts about nature, but actually doing something to protect it, then consider joining Planet Wild. You can give whatever amount feels right, every dollar counts, and the first 100 people to sign up with my code, Zoe2, get their first month on me. Just scan the QR code or click the link in the description. And if you want to see what they're about before you commit, then you can check out their mission in Tanzania that I will have linked in the end card and in the description. And if you choose to support them, you can cancel anytime, and there is absolutely no catch. So thanks again to Planet Wild for supporting this channel, and with that, let's get back to the video. All of these games say something about patriotism. Patriotism is knowing history facts, having the right political ideology, consuming the right media, doing the right hobbies. It's about winning, even when the systems are meaningless. It's about doing as little work as possible, consuming slop because you either don't know any better or you just don't care. And maybe it's just a coat of red, white, and blue paint that we can slap on anything and call it patriotic. By being competitive rather than cooperative games, they imply that patriotism is something you can win, that being a good American is about being better than others, about knowing more or doing more than the people around you. By being games for children with rules written for adults, they imply that patriotism is something to be passed down, that children are blank slates upon which their parents should carve their values. And by virtue of being trivia games, these games all imply that the patriotic nature of our history is self-evident. There's no explanation for why learning historical facts should make you proud of your country, they just expect it to do so. But how can patriotism be so many things all at once? And with such varied goals, why do they all end up using such similar mechanics? Why are they all trivia games? This choice alone says so much about these games. For one thing, it shows just how little many of these designers think of kids. They think that the young people playing these games are empty vessels to be filled with information, or balls of clay waiting to be molded into the right ideological shape. They think that kids can, and will, whether or not they want to, learn through rote historical facts rather than anything that would actually engage them with the content. Either that, or these designers don't care whether or not that's the case, and honestly, that's even worse. But for another, think about what the ubiquity of trivia says about the nature of patriotism itself. What does it say that the way we determine who's a patriot and who isn't is by testing them on obscure history facts? Does it mean patriotism is like fandom, where you prove your place in a community by showing how much information you know? And it's still not entirely clear. Are trivia questions supposed to make people patriotic, as seems to be the argument by many of these games' designers? Or is it to determine who already is patriotic? If these games are just testing who already is patriotic, then what is the point of them? But if they're supposed to induce patriotism, there doesn't seem to be a lot of work done to make that case. Like, there's nothing that tells us why these facts should make us love our country. And if patriotism is like fandom, wouldn't that be like giving someone a copy of Star Wars Trivial Pursuit and then expecting them to come away a Star Wars fan? It just doesn't make any sense. Every single one of these games, except for the one that stole its mechanics from careers, was a trivia game. All of these trivia games also claimed to want to celebrate our country's trailblazing spirit and our advancements and innovations, and yet they themselves never took any risks or tried anything new with their mechanics. Except one. In Patriot Challenge, there were no weird value judgments or biased commentary, but instead a mix of the usual fact-based questions and open-ended critical thinking questions, like asking kids how they can use their skills to help volunteer, or defining and giving examples of propaganda. The questions showed real intent by the designers to ensure that kids would be able to see how historical and civic information actually applied to their everyday lives. There was also a helping mechanic, where you could get another player to help you answer a question, and in return, split the points, incentivizing the teamwork that the designers said they were aiming for. Instead of being about regurgitating history facts, or consuming the right media, or having the right opinion, their game gestured toward the actual mechanisms of civic life: cooperation, critical thinking, conversation, community building. While the rest of the games gestured toward patriotism as fandom, as a set of trivia knowledge and opinions that signal you belong to the in-group. Patriot Challenge isn't a perfect game. It's still a trivia game, it is still largely competitive, so it still ultimately has all of those associated values embedded within it. And when it comes to how it engages with our history, the game still definitely has on those post-9/11 rose-tinted glasses. But it is the only game that felt like its creators were looking forward rather than backward. It was the only game that felt hopeful rather than cynical. And in the landscape of patriotic board games, that's the best we're gonna get. In some ways, living in the US in 2026, it feels like we are all further behind than we started. Like, everything is worse now than it was. These 7 games reflect 50 years of our culture's fraught relationship with history and education. 50 years of trying to define patriotism and pass it along to the next generation. 50 years of our nation's failure to live up to its promises of democracy and liberty and justice. These games represent 50 years of hope, 50 years of cynicism, 50 years of history that just doesn't stop happening. These games also represent 50 years of game design, and I'm gonna be honest, there are so many better board games out there. If you want to dig into some of the deeper questions about board game mechanics and embedded ideologies, I recommend Mechanisms as Metaphors by the amazing game designer Amabel Holland, as well as Is Every Game Really Political by friends of the channel No Pun Included. I was also on an episode of No Pun Included's board game podcast a couple of years ago, and I will have that linked in the description along with both of these videos. Like I said at the beginning of the video, games carry cultural baggage. They are mirrors that reflect who we are, and they are arguments that shape how we think about things. Now, I am not saying that these 7 games are like the most nefarious propaganda. Like, I don't think that when Celebrate America uses trains to send you backwards, it's some kind of subliminal anti-public transportation message, or that Rocket's sending you up is like pro-SpaceX propaganda. Most of them are just lazy cash grabs because patriotism is an easy theme to market and trivia is an easy mechanic to build a game around. But it is still worth paying attention to what these games are saying and the way that they are saying it, because it reveals a lot about us, our society, what we value and what we don't. Games, at their worst, reflect a flat, unflattering version of ourselves. But at their best, games can show us what's possible. I know which one I'd rather play. Thank you for sticking around until the end of the video. I hope that you liked it. And if you did, then be sure to like and comment and subscribe and do all those YouTube things. You know what to do. You've been here before, probably. I would like to give a big thanks to my patrons and channel members whose names are scrolling by over here, with an especially big thanks to Justin Lowry, Hugh Sophia, Shep Alderson, Megan Lowndes, and Ryan Boren. If you would like to join all of these lovely folks in the credits, then you can head on over to patreon.com/Zoe_B, where you can support my board game habit and also help me to feed my cats. Genuinely, I would not be able to do this job without all of the amazing people who donate over on Patreon, so please consider checking it out if you want me to keep doing what I do. But with that, it is time for the patron poem of the video. For Lucy S., here is How I Found the Deer. First, it was a bird. A flash of movement in the thicket, wings of some species spotted between the spindly arms of young gum trees, a clumsy mourning dove crashing through the brush. It was the ears that gave it away, white tufted triangles twitching soft against the green. Then a face, a body, dissolving into the foreground, a magic eye puzzle's suddenly obvious solution. One moment a struggle of the imagination, the next, there, a deer, all at once. In just the moment I discovered it's a lie, that mantra, that whispered wish of adventurers and children hiding from shadows. The lie that they're more scared of you. And until next time, stay safe, stay warm, and I will see y'all again soon, I hope. Bye, folks. One thing that I do think is actually like really, really funny in the PragerU game, they have little pieces that you play on the board. They're like actual like icons. You know, George Washington, Davy Crockett, Harriet Tubman, which like kind of weird that they have both, you know, abolitionist, like person who helped free other enslaved people, and also George Washington, literal slave owner. That's kind of weird. But the most funny thing is that you have one real woman, Harriet Tubman, and then also Rosie the Riveter, not a real woman. Statue of Liberty, not a real woman. But then also you have like gender ambiguous, non-binary eagle, and non-binary astronaut. Gender ambiguous astronaut, I think, is like my favorite thing. Like a statue I get, because it's like a humanoid statue, but like eagles aren't people. And so then at that point, why not also have like the Liberty Bell or the Constitution or fucking Babe the Big Blue Ox? I would play as Babe. There was a cartoon that I watched as a kid. It was, I think it was a movie that was about, what's his name? The guy, the man with the axe. And Babe, clearly I really only cared about Babe. Because I don't even remember, what is his name? What is, I don't know. Somebody in the comments, check in the comments. I'm sure somebody has said who it is. No, I'm not gonna be able to come up with it because my brain is kind of foggy, but give me Babe. I'm a Babe truther. Desmond, what do you have to say? What do you have to say for yourself? Is this your apology video? Okay.